You know what's fascinating about this exact moment we're living through? We're watching 5 separate international crises unfold simultaneously, and they're all connected by one thing. The United States is at the absolute center of every single one of them, and I mean that literally, every single story. Let me walk you through what happened in just the last 24 hours, because when you see it all laid out together, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. First, Iran. On Thursday, according to Al Jazeera and NBC News, Iran's military spokesman, Brigadier General Mohammad Akraminia, went on the record with a very specific warning. He said that if the United States attacks Iran, Tehran will immediately strike American military bases and aircraft carriers in the Gulf region. Not eventually, not after consultation, immediately. And he was very clear about why Iran feels confident making this threat. American aircraft carriers, he said, have serious vulnerabilities, and every single U.S. base in the Gulf is within range of Iran's medium-range missiles. Now, this wasn't just bluster. The Brigadier General specifically said that Iran's response would not be limited like it was back in June of last year. Instead, he said any response would be decisive and delivered instantly. That's a direct quote from TRT World and Al Jazeera's reporting. So that's Iran on Thursday, drawing a very clear red line. But here's where it gets interesting. Just 2 days later on Saturday, President Trump told reporters something completely different. According to Al Jazeera and NBC News, Trump said that Iran is, quote, seriously talking with Washington. He said Iran is talking to us and we'll see if we can do something. This came just hours after Iran's top national security official confirmed that arrangements for negotiations were indeed progressing. So which is it? Is Iran preparing for immediate military retaliation, or is Iran negotiating to avoid a conflict? The answer apparently is both. And this is where the Trump administration's approach gets revealing. Trump also said, according to Radio Free Europe, that the United States has not informed regional allies about possible strikes against Iran. When asked why, his reasoning was security concerns. Think about that for a moment. The United States won't tell its own allies in the region whether it plans to launch military strikes that could ignite a regional war. That's not normal diplomatic protocol. That's a sign of how volatile this situation has become. And the clock is ticking. Trump warned on Wednesday, according to multiple sources, that time is running out for Iran to make a deal. Meanwhile, NBC News and Al Jazeera report that the USS Abraham Lincoln Battle Group is heading toward the region right now. So you have threats, you have negotiations, you have a carrier group moving into position, and you have the United States explicitly refusing to coordinate with regional partners. Think about what this dual-track approach actually means on the ground. The Trump administration is simultaneously showing Iran the stick and offering the carrot, but doing so in a way that keeps everyone else guessing. Regional allies like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar host American military bases that would be on the front lines of any Iranian retaliation. They have a legitimate interest in knowing whether the United States is about to launch strikes that could put their territory and their populations at risk. And yet Trump is explicitly withholding that information from them in the name of operational security. This isn't how traditional American diplomacy works. Traditionally, you coordinate with allies precisely because you need their support, their basing rights, their intelligence sharing. You bring them into the planning process because their cooperation is essential to success. But this approach suggests the Trump administration either doesn't trust those allies to maintain operational security or doesn't particularly care whether they're comfortable with American military planning. Either way, it's a remarkable departure from decades of alliance management. That's the first story. Second story, Gaza. According to Al Jazeera, PBS News, and AFP, Israel announced it will reopen the Rafah border crossing this Sunday, February 1st, after being closed for nearly 2 years. Nearly 2 years. But this isn't a full reopening. The announcement makes that very clear. This will allow only limited movement of people, only those who receive prior security clearance from Israel, only in coordination with Egypt, and only under supervision of the European Union mission. Now, why does this matter right now? Because the Rafah crossing has been a flashpoint in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for years. It's been the main gateway between Gaza and Egypt, and its closure has been one of the most visible symbols of Gaza's isolation. Opening it, even in this highly controlled way, signals something. It could be a gesture toward de-escalation. It could be a response to international pressure. Or it could be strategic positioning ahead of broader regional negotiations. But the timing is not accidental. This is happening at the exact same moment that the United States is navigating this crisis with Iran, and while negotiations over Ukraine are intensifying. Which brings us to the third story, Ukraine. ABC News and the Kyiv Independent report that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky explicitly rejected Russian President Vladimir Putin's invitation to hold peace talks in Moscow, and Zelensky didn't just decline politely. He said, "I can just as well invite him to Kyiv. Let him come. I'm openly inviting him if he dares." That's a direct quote. In an interview with ABC News, Zelensky was even more blunt. He said, "I can't go to Moscow when my country's under missiles, under attack each day. I can't go to the capital of this terrorist." He emphasized that he's open to meeting Putin in any format, but he absolutely ruled out Russia or Belarus as venues. His reasoning, according to multiple sources, including India TV, was straightforward. One of these countries is the aggressor that started and is waging the war against us, while the other is its partner. Now, this rejection of Putin's invitation is significant because it shows that despite all the international pressure for negotiations, despite Trump's public interest in brokering a peace deal, Zelensky is not willing to legitimize Russia's position by meeting on Russian soil. He's drawing his own red lines. And this complicates the Trump administration's efforts to position itself as the deal maker that can end this war. But here's the fourth story. And this is where things get really interesting in terms of understanding America's global position right now. According to NPR, ESPN, and ABC News, hundreds of protesters gathered in Milan on Saturday, just yesterday, to protest the deployment of U.S. immigration and customs enforcement agents during the upcoming Winter Olympics in Italy. Hundreds of people in the streets of Milan, not protesting Russia, not protesting China, protesting the United States. The protest drew people from Italy's left-leaning Democratic Party, the CGIL trade union, and ANPI organizations. And NPR reports that the demonstration was described as being against what many saw as, quote, creeping fascism in the United States. The mayor of Milan, Giuseppe Sala, didn't mince words either. He said ICE agents are not welcome in his city. He called them, and this is a direct quote from ABC News, a militia that kills, a militia that enters into the homes of people. Let that sink in for a moment. The mayor of Milan, a major European city, one of America's NATO allies, publicly calling a U.S. federal law enforcement agency a militia that kills at a protest against American involvement in security for the Olympics. This isn't happening in Tehran or Moscow. This is happening in Milan, Italy. Now, you might say, well, that's just left-wing protesters. That doesn't represent official Italian government policy. And you'd be technically correct. But here's the thing. When hundreds of people can gather in a major European city to protest American law enforcement presence, and when the mayor of that city not only doesn't shut down the protest, but actually validates their concerns by calling ICE a militia, that tells you something about how American actions are being perceived, even among populations that have traditionally been friendly to the United States. This isn't some fringe movement. The protest included members of Italy's Democratic Party, major trade unions, and established civic organizations. This is mainstream Italian civil society saying no to an American presence on their soil. And this connects directly to the fifth story. According to Al Jazeera and multiple Turkish news sources, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi held talks in Istanbul and Ankara on Friday with Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan and President Erdogan. And what was the topic? Turkey is trying to mediate between the United States and Iran to prevent potential American military action. Wyon News and The National report that Turkish officials are specifically urging Tehran to consider concessions on its nuclear program amid escalating threats from Washington. So you have Turkey, another NATO ally, actively working to prevent the United States from launching military strikes. Turkey is positioning itself as the mediator between America and Iran, trying to talk both sides down from a potential conflict. Now step back and look at all five of these stories together. What's the common thread? In every single one, the United States is the actor that other countries are responding to, negotiating with, or protesting against. Iran is warning about immediate retaliation against American military assets while simultaneously negotiating with Washington. Israel is making moves on the Rafah crossing at a moment when American diplomatic priorities are focused on multiple fronts. Ukraine is rejecting Russia's terms, but doing so while calculating how the Trump administration's position might shift. European allies are literally protesting American law enforcement presence on their soil, and Turkey is actively mediating to prevent American military action. This is what American global power looks like in this particular moment, and it's not the triumphant hegemon narrative that we sometimes tell ourselves. It's something much more complex and, frankly, much more precarious. The United States has enormous capability to project force, to threaten military action, to shape outcomes. But that capability is generating resistance, negotiation, and protest from allies and adversaries alike. And here's the part that should worry anyone paying attention. There's no clear strategy holding these pieces together. Trump says Iran is talking to us, but Iran's military is preparing for immediate strikes. Trump wants to broker peace in Ukraine, but Zelensky won't meet on Russia's terms. The United States has a carrier group heading to the Gulf, but won't tell regional allies whether strikes are planned. American law enforcement is deployed to Italy for the Olympics, but the mayor of Milan is calling them a militia in front of hundreds of protesters. These aren't 5 separate stories. This is one story with 5 chapters, and the story is about how the United States is navigating a world where American power is still immense but increasingly contested, where allies are willing to publicly criticize and even protest American actions, where adversaries are simultaneously threatening and negotiating, and where the gap between American rhetoric and American credibility is becoming harder to ignore. The question we should be asking is not whether the United States can still project power. Obviously, it can. The question is whether that power is being used strategically, whether it's building the kind of coalitions and partnerships that make American influence sustainable, or whether we're watching the slow erosion of the international order that American leadership helped create over the past 75 years. Because when you have NATO allies mediating between you and your adversaries, when you have European mayors calling your law enforcement agencies militias, when you have adversaries threatening immediate military strikes while simultaneously negotiating, and when you're refusing to coordinate with your own allies on potential military action, that's not a sign of strength. That's a sign of a system under enormous stress. And what happens in the next few days and weeks, whether Iran and the United States find a diplomatic off-ramp, whether the Rafah crossing actually opens, and what that means for Gaza, whether Zelensky and Putin can find any common ground for negotiations, is going to tell us a lot about whether the United States can still lead effectively in a world that's increasingly skeptical of American leadership. Watch this space. All of this is happening right now, and all of it matters.